Hello everyone, in today's video I'll be showing you how to create a script for After Effects that will generate a color scheme or a color palette for you. So let's just go ahead and take a look at how this works. I've got a few examples here I'm going to use, a video of this nice beach, and a video from this space video game called Elite Dangerous. So I'm just going to select my comp here, and I'll run the script. And in just a few seconds, it'll create a 5-color palette for us that matches the main colors of our scene. And all you have to do is make sure the layer you want to analyze is on top, navigate to the timecode you want to check the colors for, and of course, run the script. And as you can see, it creates a nice color palette that easily matches our scene, and we can use this to pick colors, add in designs that will match the colors, etc. So the way it kind of works is we have our main layer. It creates a point control on it, and it automatically moves around the point and analyzes the pixels. And as you can see up in the info palette, as I scroll my mouse around the page, you can see I get different R, G, and B values. So we have a text layer for the red, green, and blue values. We move the point control to several points on the screen, and we get those into an array and create our color scheme. So as you may have noticed, there's no UI to this script, so let's just go ahead and open up extendscript and get started coding. And if you're here just for a free script, the link is in the description below for the script itself, and we'll go ahead and get started. So we'll start off by creating a variable called project, which is just going to reference our project, and we'll also make one called comp, representing our selected composition, so we'll grab the actively selected item in our project. Then we'll need to make a variable for the width of the composition, which will just be our comp.width, and we'll do the same for height, our comp.height. And now we're going to create a few arrays where we can store values and pixels. So I'll make one called pixel array, and I'll just create a new array. I'm also going to make one called R values, G values, and B values, and these are all going to be arrays as well. Then we're going to want a variable that represents how many pixels are in our image, so we'll just call it pixels, and we'll set it equal to width times height. And then we'll create a variable called x, which will set to 1, and one called y, which will also set to 1, which will be useful in the future when we start going through our scene. And finally, for the initialization variables, we'll set up an original scale variable and a scale factor variable. And these will also make more sense pretty soon. So to get started, we'll create our app.begin undo group, and we'll just call this color scheme generation. And of course, we'll put in our app.end undo group. So anything we put inside of here, we can just undo with one click. I'm just going to go ahead and zoom in here a bit so you can see the code better. We're going to start off by creating inside of our undo groups. We're going to make a variable called layer, which is going to reference our layer that's on top. So this is going to be equal to our comp.layer with the index of 1, which is the very top index. And we're going to now set our original scale variable we just made, and we'll set that equal to our layer.property called scale and its value. Now we're going to want to set up our point control. As I showed in here, we have a point control applied to our main layer, and we're also going to make a variable for the point so we can manipulate it. So I'll create a variable called point control. And we'll set that equal to our layer, the effects, and we're going to add a property with the Adobe match name Adobe Point Control. And then we're going to create a variable called point, which is going to reference the actual point value, which is going to be equal to our layer, the effects, the effect called point control, and the parameter called point. Now we're going to want to set up our 3 text layers, one for the red channel, one for the green channel, and one for the blue channel. So I'll create a variable called red text, and we'll set this equal to our composition inside of its layers, and we're just going to add text. And then we're going to want to reference our source text, which is the text that it displays in After Effects. That way we can grab that value later and push it into our pixel array of the values for the red channel. So I'll create another variable called red source text, and this is going to be equal to our red text and the property of that text called source text. And finally, we're going to want to set up an expression for our red source text. So I'll just call red source text.expression equals single quotes, and inside of here we're going to put in an expression which will get us the values. So inside of this expression, we're going to create a variable called target layer, and we're going to set this equal to this composition, and the layer is going to be this layer.index, which is the text layer's index, plus 1. And the reason we want plus 1 is once we add this text layer, it's going to be now the index of 1, and the layer that we're getting colors from is now going to be 2. And we'll end that with a semicolon. We'll create a variable called sample point, and we'll set this equal to our target layer and the effect called point control and the parameter called point. Then we'll create a variable called sample radius, which is how many pixels it's going to search on our current point controller. And we'll just set it to 1, 1. And we'll make another variable called sampled color underscore 8 bits per channel. And we'll set that equal to 255 times our target layer dot sample image, which is a built-in function. And sample image takes a few inputs, the first of which is the sample point, which is going to reference the point control point parameter. And then we'll put in the sample radius, so the search radius for the pixels. Then I'm going to set a variable called r equal to math.round, because we want a nice even number. And inside of the math round function, we'll put in our sampled color underscore 8 bits per channel. And I'm just going to turn on word wrap here. And we're going to grab the 0th value of this array, because it goes 0 being the reds, 1 being the greens, 2 being the blues, and 3 being the alpha channel. So I'll grab that, and finally I'm going to set the output string to r. Now I'm just going to copy and paste this twice so we can have one for the green and blue layers. And real quick, I'm just going to go through and replace all of these variable names from red to blue. And I'm also going to change the layer index here to +1 for the blue text, and then +3 for the green. And also instead of R, I'm going to use G and B. So now I've gone ahead and changed those up, and I just need to change these output strings to G and B. And I also need to, instead of grabbing the 0th value, need to grab the first and second value from that array. So now this will create our text with the proper settings to get the colors for us. So now we just need to set up a for loop so we can go through the image and get all of the pixel values we need. But since we are using an effect and an expression and reading text files to get our values, it can be a little bit slow. So if you've got a 1080p image, you're going to be analyzing over 2 million pixel values times 3, because there's 3 channels we're getting it off of. And if you have an even bigger image like this one right here, which is 16 million pixels times 3, you really don't want to have to go through that many times, because it's going to take you several days. So to fix this, inside of our for loop, we'll just set up a var I equals 1. We'll say for I is less than or equal to our width. We're going to increment I plus 50. Now the reason we're doing 50 is because you can basically divide your whole width by 50 and your whole height by 50 when we put in another for loop. Now it might seem like we're going to get less accuracy of the colors by incrementing by 50, but in reality what we're going to do afterwards to parse this data, it will give us the proper colors we need with less pixel input values. So we're going to put in another for loop within this one, and this one is going to be representative of our height. So create a var called e, set it equal to 1. For e is less than or equal to our height, we're going to again increment e by 50. And now inside of here, we're going to set up our point control point parameter, and we're going to set the value to a 2-dimensional array we input here, which is simply going to be I, comma, e. And that's in this case representative of width and height. So every time it goes through this for loop, it's going to change the point value and change where this point control goes to get different values. And now we're going to start pushing values into our R values, G values, and B values. So I'll start off by saying R values.push. And what we're going to push is we're first going to parse the int to make sure that we're getting a proper input, because we are reading from a text file, so we just want to make sure that it's in int form. And we're going to push our red source text dot value. And we're going to do the same thing for our G and B values. Of course, I want to change these names. And what that's going to do is go through all of our pixels, incrementing by 50 and storing all the values. So after it's done with this for loop, just for a little test, I'm going to alert our R values. So let's go ahead and test it on this image here. So I fixed a few of the typos I had, and I'll go ahead and run it again. And as you can see, we are getting all of our red values. Since it's starting at 0, 0, you can see up here it's just a lot of black, so we're getting 0 for our red values. And as it starts to sort of analyze this planet, we're getting different values. And of course, there are 3 other arrays where everything's being stored into. So after we've done all that, we have our data. So all we have to do now is parse it. But first I'm going to make sure we get rid of our point control and all of our text layers to keep things clean. So I'll just say red text.remove, blue text.remove, green text.remove, and point control.remove. And that will get rid of all of the layers after it's analyzed them. So now we just need to set up our code to kind of parse all the data that we've just gotten from our image. So we'll start off by creating a couple of arrays. Since we want 5 colors in our color palette, we're going to create 5 arrays for it. So we'll say color 1, color 2, color 3, color 4, and color 5. And again, I'm going to make all of these arrays. And we're going to want 3 more arrays here, one called lows, one called mids, and one called highs. And what these are going to be representative of are any of the lower pixel values, any of the middle pixel values, or any of the high. So lows would be anything from black up to a dark color, mids would be kind of lighter but kind of dark colors, and highs would be anything close to white. And the way we're going to do this is by adding the pixel values from each of our color arrays. So we're going to need to create a couple of variables so we can do that. The first one is total color value. And we're also going to make a variable called items, which is a new array. And this is where we're going to store everything. So we'll start off with a for loop. And inside of this for loop, we're going to say var j equals 0. And for j is less than or equal to r values increment by 1. And you can use g or b values for this because they're all going to contain the same number of items. But I'm just using r for simple purposes. And since we're just going through all the r values, here's what we're going to do. Inside of our items array, we're going to push 3 values into each index. So I'm going to surround everything by brackets here, and I'm going to say r values j, g values j, comma, b values j. And that's going to push all 3 of our values into the first, second, etc. indices of our items array. And now that we've pushed everything into our items array, we're going to set up yet another for loop here. We'll say var q is equal to 0, and for q is less than items.length q++. And inside of here, we're going to grab our total color value that we just set up, and we're going to set this equal to our items, the first index, and the r value by saying 0, plus items, the current index, and the g value, plus the items, the current index, and the b value. And then after that, we're going to say if our total color value is less than or equal to 255, which is basically representative of the lower third of all pixels, then we're going to go ahead and say lows.push, and we're going to push in our items and the current index. We're also going to say if the total color value is greater than 255 and the total color value is less than or equal to 510, we're going to grab our mids and we're going to push in our items and the current index. And finally, to grab the highs, we're going to say if the total color value is greater than 510, we're going to grab our highs and we're going to push our item at its current index. And the way I got these is I simply said, what's the highest value that the red can be? Well, it can be up to 255. If I multiply that by 3 for each of the channels, I get my maximum value. If I multiply that by 1/3, I get about 255. So anything below that should be the lows. And then I calculated the rest of that. Alright, so now we need to go ahead and push in colors to our different colors for our palette. So I'll go ahead and say color1.push, color2.push, color3.push, color4.push, and color5.push. And the way that the palettes usually work, as you can see, it goes from darkest color to lightest. So it pretty much is going from the lows up to the mids and then the highs. So for color 1, I'm going to push in our lows and the first item. For color 2, I want to push the lows, and I'm going to do a little bit of math here. I'm going to round the lows.length divided by 2, which will basically say if this has 100 items, grab item 50. If it has an odd number, make sure you round it. For color 3, I'm going to push our mids, and I'm going to push in the same thing as I have here, which is the half value of the whole length. For color 4, I'm going to push in the first index of our highs. And for color 5, I'm going to push in the highs, and again, I'm going to throw in this. So that's great. We've got all of our colors pushing into our color palette of what colors we're going to be using. But there are a few things that might have problems here. Say we had an image that was completely white. Well, that's only going to push values into the highs array. We're not going to have anything in mids or lows. So we need to do some basic validation so we can make sure that we don't have any errors when creating this. Because if we try and push any low values into color 1 or 2, and there aren't any, it's going to return nothing and give us an error. So we'll start off by saying if our lows.length is less than 1, so it's 0, it has nothing in it, and our mids.length is greater than 0, which means mids contains values, then we're going to go ahead and do something in here. So in this case, we're going to push into color 1 our mids and the first value inside of that, because if we have no lows but we have mids, that's the next best thing. And because we don't have any lows, we also need to put in something for color 2. So in this case, we're going to push in our mids, and we'll throw in our little equation here. Now we'll go ahead and say if our lows.length is less than 1, and our mids.length is also less than 1, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to grab color 1, and we're going to have to push in what we have, which is going to be our highs and the first value. And for color 2, we're going to want to push in our highs and our little equation. And then finally, we're going to say if our lows.length is greater than 0, and this would be the case if you had sort of a normal image with actual lows in it, then we're going to go ahead and push in these here. So I'll paste them in here. So there we go, we've got code for our lows, and no matter what, we're going to have something in our color 1 and color 2. Now we've got to set them up for if we don't have any mids or if we don't have any highs. So we'll start off by saying if mids.length is less than 1, and if lows.length is greater than 0. For color 3, we're going to push in our lows, and we're going to go ahead and round our lows there. And then we'll say if our mids.length is less than 1 and our lows.length is less than 1. Then for color 3, we're going to want to push our highs and our little equation that rounds it. And finally, the standard case, if mids.length is greater than 0, then we're simply going to grab our color 3 and push mids, and we'll go ahead and grab the half point value and round it. And finally, let's set up our validation for our highs. So if our highs.length is less than 1 and our mids.length is greater than 0, for color 4, we're going to want to push our first index of our mids. And for color 5, we're going to want to push our mids and the halfway point rounded. And we just need to set up 2 more if statements here. We'll say if highs.length is less than 1 and mids.length is less than 1. Then for color 4, we're going to want to push in our lows and the first value there. And for color 5, we're going to want to push in our lows and the halfway point. And finally, if our highs.length is greater than 0, for color 4, we're going to push in our highs and the first index. And for color 5, we're going to push in our highs index halfway. So I know that's a lot of code just for some simple validation, but it's basically just going to make sure no matter the image, it's always going to make an accurate color palette. So I'll go ahead and get rid of these 3 lines here. And now we can just set up our color palette. To do this, we're going to create 5 variables, one for each of our solids. We'll say solid 1, solid 2, solid 3, solid 4, and of course, solid 5. So for solid 1, we're going to set this equal to comp.layers, and we're going to add a solid. And first off, we need to put in the color of our solid. So we're going to type in color 1, and we're going to grab the first index and the first value there. And we're going to divide it by 255 because when we input color values here, it needs to be from 0 to 1 instead of 0 to 255. And then we'll say color 1 first index, and we're going to grab the G value. And of course, color 1 first index and the B value. Then the next argument is the name. We'll just call it color 1. And then we'll need to grab our width. So I'll just say comp.width. And for height, comp.height. The pixel aspect ratio, which is just going to be 1. And the duration, so I'll just say comp.duration. And I'm just going to take this code and copy it to the rest of these. So that way we can easily modify it here. So we'll say instead of color 1, we'll say color 2. Call this one color 3, color 4, and color 5. So again, I'm just going to go through here and start replacing these to make sure we're putting the right array into the right solid here, going from color 1 all the way up to color 5. And now we've done that. So now let's go ahead and run the script just to make sure we're somewhere where we want to be. I'll drag this into new comp here, and I'll go ahead and run it. You can see it's created our text layers. It's now going through and analyzing all of our pixels, incrementing by 50. And then it's going to go through and store them appropriately. So one thing I forgot to do is divide all the color channel values divided by 255. So I'll go ahead and put that in really quick. And now let's go ahead and test out our script here. And as you can see, we've generated 5 different colors, but they're currently taking up the entire space of our composition. So we need to go ahead and change that. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and get each of our solids out here. So solid 1, 2, 3, 4, and solid 5. And we're going to set each of their scales to 10% of what it is now. So we're going to grab the property called scale, and we'll set the value to 10, 10. Make sure you have your brackets in there. And I'll paste this for each of the solids. And I'll go ahead and create a couple of variables here, one called base scale, which I'll set to our comp.width divided by 2. And this is sort of the default positioning that this will use. So this is 960, which is really 1920 divided by 2. So I just need to grab that, and I'll also set up base y. This could really be base x, honestly. And base y will be equal to comp.height divided by 2. And now we're just going to set up the positioning for each of our solids. So I've called each of my solids here, and what I'm going to do is set up their property called position, and I'll set the value to our base x and our base y times 1.856. Now the reason I'm doing that is because it's going to basically put it in the proper position down at the bottom here. You can basically reverse engineer it by taking the original position it places it and then calculating the difference between where it was and where it is. And I'll go ahead and paste this for the other solids here. And now we just need to change the base x's, which is the x position it's going to change. For solid 2, we'll multiply it by 1.2, solid 3, 1.4, solid 4, 1.6, and solid 5, 1.8. And finally, the last line of code is to pre-compose these. So I'll say comp.layers.precompose, and this will take 2 arguments, the first of which is an array of the indices that we want to pre-compose. So we'll say 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And those will refer to our first 5 layers, in this case our newly created solids. And we'll just call this color scheme. So finally, let's run this code inside of After Effects. Click on play. And we forgot a multiplication sign there. Click on play again. Now it's going through and analyzing. And of course, a simple typo prevented us from finishing this. It needs to be comp.layers. And as you can see, we've now created an accurate color palette for our video or image. So that was a lot of code we went over, and there might have been some confusion sometime along the way, so just go back in and take a look. You can also download the script in the description below if you just want to get started using it. But thank you for watching, and make sure you subscribe and like the video if you enjoyed it. If you have any requests for future videos, just leave those in the comments, but we will see you next time.